My twin brother's 12-year family blackmail ring led to a child's murder. I never thought my identical twin brother would become the monster who destroyed our family. But here we are, sitting in a courtroom watching him get sentenced for murder while I testify about the horrors I discovered in his laptop. Let me back up, though, because this story starts way before that December morning when I found the cameras in my childhood bedroom. My name is Sarah, and my twin brother Michael and I are 28 years old now. We grew up in what everyone thought was the perfect suburban family. Mom stayed home with us kids, Dad worked as an insurance adjuster, and we had Sunday dinners with Grandma Rose every week. Our older sister Jessica moved back home after her divorce 2 years ago with her baby daughter Emma, and our cousin Kevin lived with us on and off during college while he studied to become a doctor. Michael and I were always close growing up. That twin bond thing people talk about, but something changed when we hit 16. He became secretive, spending hours alone in his room with his computer, claiming he was into photography and web design. Mom and Dad were just happy he had hobbies that kept him out of trouble. The first red flag should have been when he got arrested at 17 for taking pictures up girls' skirts at the mall. The charges were dropped because he was a minor, and it was his first offense. But the prosecutor, a man named David Chen, made it clear that Michael was lucky and needed to stay out of trouble. Our parents were mortified and made Michael see a therapist for 6 months. But we all just pretended it never happened after that. Michael went to community college while I went away to state school. And when I came back for visits, he always seemed to know things about our family that he shouldn't have known. Like when Dad was having his midlife crisis and bought that expensive motorcycle, Michael somehow knew about it before Mom did. Or when Jessica was having problems with her ex-husband, Michael would make these knowing comments that made everyone uncomfortable. I figured he was just good at reading people. You know, that twin intuition thing taken to an extreme. After college, I moved to Chicago for my marketing job while Michael stayed local and worked at an electronics store. He still lived at home, which wasn't that weird since rent was expensive and he was supposedly saving money. He visited me in Chicago a few times, and I visited home for holidays and family events. Michael always brought his camera equipment everywhere, said he was building a portfolio for freelance work. He took tons of photos at family gatherings, always positioning himself to get candid shots when people weren't paying attention. We all just thought he was being artistic. The problems really started escalating about 3 years ago during Thanksgiving dinner. Michael made this comment about how Uncle James had been texting someone inappropriate messages, and Uncle James went white as a sheet. When pressed, Michael just shrugged and said he'd seen the phone screen when Uncle James left it on the counter. But I was sitting right there and I never saw Uncle James text anyone. A few weeks later, Uncle James and Aunt Patricia got divorced. She claimed he'd been having an affair, but he swore he hadn't done anything wrong. Michael seemed almost pleased when he heard about the divorce. Then last Christmas, something really weird happened. Michael cornered our cousin Kevin, who's now a resident at the local hospital, and they had this intense whispered conversation by the kitchen. Kevin looked terrified, and when I asked what they were talking about, Michael just smiled and said they were discussing Kevin's career prospects. 2 months later, Kevin suddenly broke up with his longtime girlfriend Sarah and moved back in with his parents, claiming he needed to focus on work. But Kevin had been talking about proposing to Sarah for months. When I asked him what happened, he just said Michael had shown him some things that made him realize he wasn't ready for marriage. The breaking point came this past December, when our whole extended family gathered at Mom and Dad's house for Christmas. I was staying in my old bedroom for the weekend, and on Christmas morning I noticed something glinting behind my dresser. When I moved the dresser to investigate, I found a tiny wireless camera no bigger than a button, carefully hidden but positioned to capture the entire room. My blood went cold as I realized what this meant. I spent the next hour searching every room in the house while everyone was busy with presents downstairs. I found cameras in Jessica's room, positioned to capture her bed and changing area. I found one in the guest bathroom where Grandma Rose would have been staying. I found cameras in Mom and Dad's bedroom, in the living room positioned to capture the couch where people often had private conversations, and even one in the basement rec room where Kevin had been sleeping on the fold-out couch. My hands were shaking as I collected 7 cameras total, each one a sophisticated wireless model that would have cost several $100s. As I stared at the tiny devices in my palm, I realized that Michael had been spying on our family for years. I knew I should confront him immediately, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was that twin bond, or maybe I was just in shock. But instead of calling him out in front of everyone, I decided to gather more evidence first. That evening, when everyone was watching movies, I snuck into Michael's room and found his laptop. It wasn't password protected, which should have been another red flag. What I found when I opened it made me physically sick. There were thousands of photos and videos organized in folders by person's name and date. Jessica breastfeeding Emma, captured from multiple angles over several months. Dad meeting with a woman who definitely wasn't Mom at a coffee shop, then later in a hotel room. Grandma Rose in various states of undress during her visits. Kevin with what appeared to be prescription pills that weren't his. And later Kevin with his ex-girlfriend in intimate moments that should have been private. But the worst part was the subfolder labeled Sarah, which contained hundreds of photos and videos of me changing clothes, sleeping, and even private phone conversations with boyfriends, dating back to when I was 16 years old. I realized that Michael had been documenting our family's most private moments for over a decade, building some sick collection of our secrets and vulnerabilities. I was about to confront him when my phone rang. It was Michael, and his voice was panicked. "Sarah, I need to talk to you right now," he said. "Meet me at the park where we used to play as kids. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going." Something in his tone made me grab the laptop and drive to the park. Michael was pacing by the old swing set, and when he saw me, he looked relieved but also terrified. "Sarah, I'm in serious trouble," he said. "There was an accident last night. I hit someone with my car. My stomach dropped." "What do you mean you hit someone?" "A little girl," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She ran into the street and I couldn't stop in time. She's dead, Sarah. I killed a 7-year-old girl." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "Did you call the police? Did you stop to help her?" "I panicked," he said. "I drove away. But there were witnesses and they got my license plate. The police are going to come for me, probably tomorrow or the next day. I could go to prison for 15 years for vehicular manslaughter." That's when he told me his plan, and everything became clear. He needed an alibi, and he wanted our family to lie and say he was at home with us during the time of the accident. And if we didn't cooperate, he would release every photo and video he'd collected over the years. "Think about what this would do to everyone," he said. "Dad's affair would destroy Mom. Jessica's private moments with Emma would be all over the internet. Grandma Rose would be humiliated. Kevin would lose his medical license for the drug use, and your own private moments would be public forever." I felt like I was looking at a stranger, even though he had my exact face. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" he asked. "This," I said, holding up his laptop. "The cameras, the photos, the blackmail. How long have you been collecting ammunition against our own family?" He had the decency to look ashamed for a moment. "It started as just curiosity," he said. "But then I realized how useful the information could be. People are always more cooperative when you know their secrets." That's when I knew I was dealing with someone who was completely beyond redemption. I told him I needed time to think about it, and he gave me until the next morning to convince the family to provide his alibi. I drove home with his laptop, my mind racing. I spent that night going through every file, and what I found was even worse than I'd initially thought. The photos and videos weren't just random voyeuristic collection. They were carefully curated evidence of everyone's most vulnerable moments. Michael had been systematically documenting anything that could be used as leverage. But there was something else in the files that made my blood run cold. In a folder labeled Target Research, I found detailed information about David Chen, the prosecutor who had handled Michael's case when he was 17. Photos of Chen's house, his car, his daily routine, and most disturbingly, photos of his 7-year-old daughter Emma walking to school. The same Emma who had been killed in the hit and run. I realized that this wasn't an accident at all. Michael had deliberately targeted the prosecutor's daughter, probably as revenge for the humiliation he'd suffered as a teenager when Chen had threatened him with serious consequences if he reoffended. This changed everything. This wasn't vehicular manslaughter. This was premeditated murder of a child. I knew I couldn't let my family become accessories to this crime, no matter what embarrassing photos Michael had collected. But I also knew that if I went to the police immediately, he would release everything out of spite, so I came up with a different plan. The next morning, I called Michael and told him that I'd talked to the family and we were willing to provide his alibi. I said we'd all testify that he was home playing video games with me during the time of the accident, and that we'd been together all evening. He was so relieved he almost cried. "I knew you'd come through for me," he said. "We're twins. We stick together." But I also told him that we needed to coordinate our stories carefully, and that the police investigation might take weeks or even months. I fed him false information about the timeline, telling him that witnesses weren't sure about the exact time of the accident, and that the police were still processing evidence. Meanwhile, I was secretly working with David Chen and the police. I contacted Chen's office and told them I had information about his daughter's death. When I showed them the contents of Michael's laptop, including the target research folder with photos of Emma, they immediately understood that this was a planned murder, not a random accident. The police set up surveillance on Michael while I continued to feed him false information about the investigation. I told him that there had been other hit-and-run accidents in the area, so the police were investigating multiple cases and it might be months before they focused on him specifically. This bought us time to build a solid case without Michael releasing the photos in panic, but Michael was getting increasingly paranoid as weeks went by. He kept asking me for updates on what the police were doing, and I could tell he was starting to suspect that something was wrong. The breaking point came 6 weeks later when I told him that I'd heard the police were planning to make arrests in several hit-and-run cases the following week. I suggested that maybe he should consider leaving town for a while, just to be safe. That was exactly what the police and I were hoping he would do. 2 days later, Michael withdrew $15,000 from his bank account, packed a suitcase, and drove toward the Canadian border. The police arrested him at the border crossing when he tried to flee the country. The attempt to flee destroyed any credibility he might have had, and when the police searched his room, they found all his camera equipment and additional storage devices containing even more compromising photos and videos of our family and other people. During the investigation, we learned that Michael had been systematically stalking and photographing people for years. The cameras in our family's house were just the beginning. He had similar setups in the homes of co-workers, neighbors, and even strangers whose routines he had learned. The district attorney charged him with first-degree murder for Emma's death, multiple counts of voyeurism and invasion of privacy, blackmail, and several other felonies. The evidence was overwhelming, especially the target research folder that proved he had planned Emma's murder for months. Our family was devastated by the revelations, but we all agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution. The embarrassing photos were entered as evidence but sealed by the court to protect our privacy, and Michael's attempt to use them as blackmail actually worked against him by demonstrating his pattern of manipulating and controlling people. The trial lasted 3 weeks. David Chen gave heartbreaking testimony about his daughter Emma, who had been a bright, happy 7-year-old who loved drawing and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. The prosecution laid out how Michael had spent months planning her murder as revenge for a juvenile case from over 10 years earlier. Our family testified about the cameras, the photos, and Michael's history of voyeuristic behavior. Jessica broke down on the stand when she described learning that her private moments with her baby daughter had been violated and collected as blackmail material. Michael's defense tried to argue that Emma's death was still an accident, that the target research was just coincidental, and that the photos were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent. But the evidence was too strong, and his attempt to flee the country had already shown his consciousness of guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Emma's murder, plus an additional 20 years for the other charges. In his final statement before sentencing, Michael looked directly at me and said, "You destroyed our family, Sarah. Everything we had is gone because of what you did." I looked back at him and said, "No, Michael. You destroyed our family the moment you decided to violate everyone who trusted you. I just made sure you couldn't hurt anyone else. That was 8 months ago. Our family is still recovering from the trauma of learning that someone we loved and trusted had been systematically violating our privacy for over a decade. Mom and Dad are in counseling. Jessica has moved to a new state with Emma to start fresh. And Kevin is rebuilding his life after the stress nearly destroyed his medical career. David Chen and his wife started a foundation in Emma's memory that works to protect children from predators and voyeurs. I volunteer with them now, helping other families who have discovered hidden cameras and privacy violations. I've learned that the twin bond I thought I had with Michael was probably one-sided. He never saw me as his sister and partner. He saw me as another target for his collection. The closeness I felt was really just his way of staying close enough to monitor and control me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret turning in my own brother. If I feel guilty that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. The answer is no. Michael made his choices, and those choices included murdering an innocent child and terrorizing our family for years. Emma Chen would be 8 years old now if she had lived. She deserved to grow up, to become that veterinarian she dreamed of being. My brother took that away from her and her family, and he was planning to use our family's shame to escape the consequences. The hardest part has been accepting that the person I thought I knew never really existed. The Michael I grew up with was a carefully constructed facade, hiding someone who was capable of unthinkable cruelty. But I'm glad I found the strength to see past that facade and do what was right, even when it meant losing the brother I thought I had. Justice for Emma was more important than protecting the reputation of someone who had forfeited any claim to family loyalty. And in the end, that's what I'll always believe was the right choice. Michael will never hurt another child, and our family, while scarred, is finally free from his manipulation and control. That's the closest thing to a happy ending we're going to get, and honestly, it's enough.